Hello everyone and welcome back to the Blue Collar DM. My name is Howard and today we're going to be talking about magic in Dungeons & Dragons and how it can affect your first time game. Let's get to it. Alright, so the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what is magic in Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it's basically kind of what you instinctually think about when you think about magic. It can be portrayed in a lot of different ways in the D&D multiverse. There are a lot of different interpretations of what magic could be in your game. It can be seen as a way to control energies in the universe and being able to manipulate those energies in order to elicit different magical effects that you want to have happen. It can also be a way of controlling the chaos that is the energy around us and, again, harnessing that energy in order to create whatever magical effect you're looking to have. The most readily form of this magic being portrayed and conjured is in the form of spells, and we're going to talk about that here today in this video. So what is a spell? I mean, generally, a spell is generally defined as a singular magical effect that can be created via specific means. Oftentimes, these are done via certain patterns that have to be elicited, whether it be somatically with your hands or verbally. But at the end of the day, what it does, basically, is that these specific patterns, in order to pull this magic from the universe, is then utilized to conjure the elements, or restore wounds, remove and inflict a condition, give life to death, and a lot of other things as well. In Dungeons & Dragons, mechanically, spells are actually organized in levels. Now, these levels range from level 0 all the way up to level 9. The level of the spell is generally a good indication about how powerful the spell is. So, level 1 spells, generally speaking, are kind of your more lower tier spells, and then level 9 are some of your more powerful spells. Now, I didn't forget level 0 by accident. Level 0 spells are actually also known as cantrips, and generally these spells are very minute little harnessing of the energies of the magic around us. They're not really that powerful, and they can pretty much be cast at will by the user. While spell level is a good indicator about how powerful a spell is, spell level and character level in Dungeons & Dragons don't necessarily correlate. So there are certain character classes that can actually cast higher level spells much sooner than others. Wizards, generally speaking, can cast higher level spells sooner than, say, a rogue that is an arcane trickster, for example. Now, in order to be able to cast a spell, you have to know what the spell is. It goes without saying, but it's something that needs to be addressed in Dungeons & Dragons because the ease of access to all the spells in, say, the basic rules document or the player's handbook make it so you can look ahead to what you're going to learn later on down the line. But like I said, at the end of the day, a spellcaster needs to know how to cast the spell and what the spell is before they can cast it. Some of them have the ability to cast all the spells that they know in their brain. So, for an example, sorcerers learn a certain set number of spells that they learn, and then they can use them anytime they want during the adventuring day. However, other spellcasting classes, like wizards, have access to a lot more spells, and so do clerics as well, and they actually have to pick a certain number of spells each day at the beginning of the day to have in their brain to think about whenever they're going to be doing anything later that day. So, if you don't prepare the spell that day as a cleric, then you actually don't have access to it that day. But if you need it the next day, you can prepare it on the next morning. So one of the big other mechanical pieces of spells is actually known as spell slots. Now, like we were talking about before, those level 0 spells can be cast at will. They actually don't use a spell slot, which is great because then we can actually utilize those different magical effects more often. However, for anything more powerful than a cantrip, we actually have to use a spell slot. Spell slots are actually organized the same way the spells are. There are certain different levels of spell slot that can be utilized. Generally speaking, the higher your character level, the more access to higher level spells you have. Generally speaking, the higher your character level, the higher level spells that you have access to, and the higher level of spell slots you have access to. In order to be able to cast a spell, you actually have to have a spell slot of that given level or higher. So, for example, if we wanted to cast a level 3 spell, we would have to use a level 3 spell slot. Or there is actually the opportunity to upcast spells. So a good example of this is, say, if you have a level 1 Cure Wounds and you have level 3 spell slots, if you either run out of level 1 spell slots, or you want to upcast that spell because it has a greater effect at a higher level usage, you can actually cast it at level 3 and have a greater effect. Now, not all spells work this way. Some, when upcast, don't actually change the spell itself, but you have that flexibility to be able to use a higher level spell slot for a lower level spell, which is nice. With that said, however, you cannot take a higher level spell and use a lower level spell slot. So if you have an 8th level spell and you're out of 8th level spell slots, you can't then just use a level 7 slot because you have it. You can't work backwards, you can only work forwards. So if you had a level 9 slot, you could use that level 8 spell there. And then like we said before, cantrips or those level 0 spells, if you haven't figured it out, you can cast them at will, which is the kind of the great thing about them. They do actually improve over time, though. So as you gain levels in your class, slowly but surely, those cantrip, like whether it be damage dice or whatever the effect is, actually increases at certain given levels. And you can find out what those are in your player's handbook or in the standard rules document. All right, so now let's talk about some different types of spells. So one different type of spell, comparatively to the rest of them, is actually called a ritual. So a ritual spell, or any spell that has the ritual tag, and you can see what those are on the spell descriptions when you look at them in the standard rules document. Any spell with that ritual tag can actually be cast as a ritual. So instead of using a spell slot, one can take 10 minutes to then cast that spell. A good example of this would be Detect Magic. You can cast it instantaneously using a spell slot. However, if there is no certain time crunch on how long you need to have in order to be able to cast that spell, you can actually cast it as a ritual and not use a spell slot, saving those resources for later on in the adventuring day. In order to be able to cast a spell as a ritual, however, the character needs to have access to ritual casting as part of their character class. A good example of this is the cleric has ritual casting as part of their character class. Alright, so then when we cast a spell, there are certain statistics we need to look at. So, for example, casting time. Casting time is going to affect how and when we can use certain spells. Some castings of spells utilize your action, and that is the casting time is 1 action. Some only use a bonus action. Some are a reaction. However, there are certain cases where you can't cast certain spells given what you've already done on your turn. So, for example, if you cast a bonus action spell like a Healing Word, the only other thing you can do on your turn with your action is to actually utilize a cantrip or the attack action or any of those other actions. You cannot then cast another leveled spell. And then the way you use your spell as a reaction is that if the spell's description actually says that the casting time is 1 reaction, it'll say what that is and what the specific conditions are in order to be able to use that spell on that spell description. And then also some casting times are even longer than your bonus action, or reaction. Some of them are much longer. One case is the ritual casting like we talked about that could take 10 minutes. But other spells just have generally longer casting times. And generally these are for spells that have a much either longer or greater effect. But there are specific cases. And again, those spell descriptions will dictate when a spell casting is actually going to be longer than your typical action, bonus action, or reaction. So another thing to consider when we're casting spells is the spell's range. Now, some spells have ranges that vary all over the board. Some you have to go right up and touch somebody in order to have the elicited effect. In others, you can do from a distance. In order to figure that out, we actually see that there is a range component of that spell description that we can see. Now, anything that's within that range, we can cast that spell on. So, for example, a firebolt has a really long range, but even if it were short of that range, we can still cast it. But if we're beyond that range, then obviously we won't be able to hit anything with that. Now, the other thing that we have to take into consideration is actually components of the spell. So, in order to be able to cast certain spells, you actually have to do certain things in order to make them happen. So, typically speaking, you'll see in the spell description the initials V, S, and maybe even M, depending on what spell it is. So, what those stand for is verbal, somatic, and material. And different spells require different components. Some only require verbal components. Some only require somatic components, which somatic components are actually either intricate hand movements or weird gesticulations in order to be able to make the magical effect happen. And then the other component is the material component. Now, some spells have material components, some don't. Depending on what the material is, it's going to require different requirements. So, for example, if there is a material component, but it does not have a gold cost and it is not consumed by the spell, you can actually utilize what's known as a component pouch or a spell focus in order to be able to cast that spell with the spell focus or the component from the component pouch as the material focus instead. Now, in that specific case of if that particular item has a gold cost, for example, Identify the spell requires you to have a 100 gold piece worth pearl in order to be able to cast it. You actually have to have that material, that 100 gold piece worth pearl, in order to be able to cast that spell Identify. If the material says that it is consumed by the spell, then you have to have that certain number of material on hand in order to be able to make that spell happen. So a good example of this is Find Familiar requires a certain amount of incense that is then consumed as a part of the spell. In that specific case, you need to have that in order to be able to then cast Find Familiar. So, as you can see, it can be a little bit more complicated magic in Dungeons & Dragons than just kind of a flick of the wrist and things happen. Sometimes you need to actually have certain pieces of material in order to make it happen. Another thing we need to consider when we're casting spells is actually spell duration. So this is different than casting time a little bit, but basically certain spells have certain durations. Some are only instantaneous, some span a certain amount of time. But in the cases where those spells spend a certain amount of time, so let's say that a casting duration is 10 minutes in time. Over the course of that 10 minutes of time, you must maintain concentration on that spell. And what that means is that you need to spend some of your brain power in order to be able to maintain the magical effect that's happening for 10 minutes. So there are certain cases where that magical concentration can break. So if you try to cast another concentration spell, the concentration on that first spell that you tried to cast is broken because you need to now then concentrate on something else. And whether or not a spell has concentration or not will be depicted in the spell's description, but it's a good way to also make sure that you're not like accidentally ending a spell early by making sure you're reading the full spell description. Because you can still cast a spell, but it can't also then be another concentration spell unless you're planning on ending the first one. Another way concentration can be broken actually is if you take damage. So if you take damage during the course of combat while you're concentrating on a spell, there's actually a certain save that you're going to have to make, and that is actually a Constitution saving throw in order to make sure you can actually keep your mind focused on that spell while you're getting hit, which makes sense because it's going to be much harder to concentrate on something when you have things attacking you and hitting you. And the other way that a spell's concentration can end is actually if you fall unconscious or you pass out. For obvious reasons, it's very hard to concentrate on a spell and maintain a magical effect if you're unconscious. And then the final mechanical piece that we have to think about is actually the target of the spell. So there's a lot. It kind of goes hand in hand with range a bit, but the target of the spell is going to impact how you cast that spell and the ways that you might direct it. So for example, some spells have an area of effect. So some spells actually come out in a cone or a cube or a cylinder or a line or a sphere. Some spells are cast on self, or some are cast on touch, or some are cast on a point in range. But regardless of it, every spell is going to have a specific target, and that can again be depicted again if you read out the spell's description what the target must be. Along with the target, there are certain ways to know whether or not a spell is effective or not. Another thing to keep in mind when casting a spell is whether or not it's going to require a saving throw or if it's going to require an attack roll by the caster. So certain spells require certain rules. The way those are broken down are again in the spell description, but certain spells are going to require a saving throw by the target. Some spells are going to require an attack roll by the caster, and depending on the situation, it may be better to cast a spell that has an attack roll because then you have the control over whether or not the attack hits or not. And in some situations, it's better that the opponent has control over it via a saving throw, depending on the scenario. Maybe your attack bonus to hit isn't very high, but your chances of having your opponent fail their saving throw in order to avoid the magical attack is also going to be a much better opportunity for you. So depending on the scenario, you want to look at the spells that you have on your list and determine which ones are going to be most effective in a given situation. And then finally with magic, the one thing you might be asking yourselves is, can I stack magics on each other? And to an extent, yes, but no. So for example, if you have an effect that's going to have the same effect as something that's already affecting a target player or monster, like say if you cast Bless on one of your players and then another one of your teammates want to cast Bless on that same player, those bonuses don't stack on each other. Only one effect from Bless can happen. However, if say that you cast Cat's Grace on one of your players and then your friend wants to cast Bless, those magical effects actually will combine. So there are certain situations where synergies can happen, and oftentimes it's actually really fun to figure out how different magics can actually synergize with each other. And that's a full breakdown of magic in Dungeons & Dragons. Now if you have any specific rule questions or any questions about magic in general or anything about Dungeons & Dragons, don't hesitate to leave a comment down in the comment section below. As always, I'm open to feedback on anything that you see on this channel, and don't hesitate to leave a comment down there for that too. I do truly hope that you gained a lot from this video, especially more knowledge about the magic system in Dungeons & Dragons, and I hope you have fun when you go out and play your first game and have to deal with this at your table. Till next time, guys. See y'all soon.